Okay, so this is part 3 of my commentary on chapter 23 of the Proverbs. I had finished last time with verse 27. Now, the problem was verse 27 and verse 28 were related, or are related. And so I'll have to do a bit of a recap here on verse 28. I'll try not to make it very long at all, maybe a minute or two, and then we'll get into verse 28. Verse 27, "For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lies in wait as for a prey, and increases the transgressors among men." And that's verse 28. So of this verse 27, I had outlined this illustration and image. For whatever reason, my mind is quite partial to that of the forest or of the wood. I live in the Midwest of the United States, and this type of thing is around me. And I find it therapeutic, dangerous, beautiful. It's sort of all of the above. And there's something in particular about the woods at night. And I had used this image of the woods at night to represent this whore as the deep ditch. And that this deep ditch is a place for which the bad road, the road that the whore is on, the road that she chooses for herself, despite her circumstances, necessarily leaves her in a degree of darkness. It's not necessarily to say, or I should say, it's not necessarily the case that because she has embarked on this path that she is evil. It doesn't mean that. It just means that the path is dark, and it's difficult to make the types of solid connections and bonds that man would like to have or to create with other people if one is engaged in this type of occupation. And I think it's more than just the straightforward selling one's body for money. There are plenty of people that do that now on the internet, make substantial amounts of money, and they are quite rich. They do well for themselves, and perhaps they consider themselves happy to a degree. And I won't even deny their happiness. I will not say that what they experience is anything other than some genuine emotion of happiness. It may not be very sophisticated, but it's there. And the reason that I say that is because it's a matter of where the attention is. It's a matter of where the attention truly chooses to place what they value and what is good. Certain things are just going to be above others and below others. This prostitution business, the selling of one's body for money, is quite vain and superficial. And I think it occupies a lower level, lower space. And so the attention occupies that lower level and lower space. That in and of itself is, it could be bad. Might not necessarily be bad. There are plenty of things for which my own mind and many minds attribute to be a good thing, but perhaps it's not all that as good as we think it to be. But anyway, this deep ditch is a place that the prospector, the person that wishes to pay for the good and service, pay for the service, I should say, finds himself within the deep ditch by participating with that thing that she is participating in. So they sort of blind each other in that strange manner. The relationship that they form, bizarrely enough, causes them to lose sight. The road itself that they're on is already darkened relative to the light road. And so because of this, the grand map of goodness, or of just generally the map around which they can understand behavior, interaction, psychology, philosophy, I think is dimmed, dulled. And the deep ditch is it's a metaphor, it's a symbol for a continued expansion or expression of that darkness and difficulty of understanding that which is outside of it. The strange woman is a narrow pit. This is a warning against the foreigner, the foreign woman that would choose to plant the seed in her soil, as it were. And by her strangeness, by the unfamiliarity of her customs, she introduces that to her child, she introduces that to her husband, to her culture, but I would say most importantly to the man that she decides to raise a child with, because the child will take from the mother quite a lot. And the narrow pit, much like the whore, although the strange woman doesn't necessarily occupy the same space, the narrow pit is the temptation pit. It is narrow so that, for the most part, not many people will fall into it. We may stumble over it, but we can catch ourselves and bring ourselves out of it, unlike the deep ditch, which might be a bit more superficial. The narrow pit is a pit of enticement. We are invited into it, but it is deeper and darker. So here's where verse 28 comes into play. She also lies in wait as for a prey, and increases the transgressors among men. Now I had finished interpreting verse 27 before I moved on to 28 in the last episode, and I think much of what I had said then covers what I see here, and in fact what I just said I think covers a fair bit of this here. That pit, that deep, narrow pit, is something that we are unlikely to be fooled by, because it's easy just to walk over it. It's probably just large enough we can imagine a physical place, walking on a trail in the woods, whereas this sort of out of the ordinary hole seems like a man-made hole. It's difficult to understand how this would come to be any other way. And yet it is there, it is deep. The enticing voice, the curiosity that comes from the strangeness of this hole, it's so out of place. But it's out of place for a reason. Perhaps inside of it there's a trap, or there's a bear, or there's a lion, or it could be a lion den. I was thinking in the woods and thinking like a wolf's den. And so this imagery is meant to convey that strangeness has a purpose. Strangeness in and of itself will probably tempt or prompt our curiosity. It doesn't mean at the end of our curious experience that when we uncover the strangeness we'll find something evil or bad. In the verse it is implying that, but I don't think necessarily that's what it means. It is the case here that we are examining the possibility of a woman that is using the foreign and the strange to her advantage to bring the seed to her such that she can propagate her way, her being, out into the future. Now, I've said this before, I don't think it's necessarily the case that many actions of man are explicitly understood. This is why I think many people come to faith in the first place, is because there seems to be this aspect of our reality and of our existence that comes back to us to show us the way, to show us the error that we may have committed, that there is something outside of the self, that not everything is dependent upon selfish action and direction. She increases transgressors among men. This concept of transgression, I think, is interesting. It's always been interesting. The image that I see here is more of a desert landscape. It is the transgressor's desert. It's barren, a bit perhaps melancholic, but we can examine all of the geography, the geology that's in the area. We can imagine of a time that once was, when rivers flowed and flowers bloomed. And now it's flat, or perhaps not flat, I should say, but it's void of these things, the running water and the plants. And we are left with this basic boundary. On one side, we have the place that we ought not to go, and on the other side, we have more of a cultivated, fruitful place, that which is. And to transgress is to move across that boundary into the space of error. Now, much like I mentioned earlier, about the nature of the horror, about the nature of the strange person, it may not necessarily be the case that the transgression is bad. I think there's a healthy amount of transgression that's necessary in every one of us in order for us to learn that there are things to transgress in the first place. I think the key comes in when we ask ourselves, how much transgression can we handle? Or perhaps we don't ask ourselves the question at all, and we pretend that the boundary isn't there at all, and we wish to deceive ourselves into thinking that we can take whatever we want, and that we are independent of the rest of it, or do whatever we want. And it's hard to say exactly where the healthy boundary is beyond the point of transgression. I suppose it's different for every person, for every society. I think idealistically we can say that we want to avoid all error, but we know that can't happen. We make error all the time, every day. It may not be significant or large, but we make it, even if it's just something as simple as catching our toe against the carpet as we walk. But all the same, and this seems to be a bit of more of a statistical analysis here than anything, but despite the fact that we make error, it certainly doesn't mean that we willfully produce error or deceitfully produce error. Like if we are to lie to ourselves and say, pick any example, any personal example of eating a particular food, giving ourselves some reason, some justification. That justification probably is very poor and unable to hold the behavior that we wish it to hold, because the consequence or the repetition of small transgressions may lead to large consequences down the road, like health consequences of eating a particular way, for example. Moreover from that, just because error exists doesn't mean that we have to or that we can afford separation from all risk. We have to have some level for which we are risk averse. Now, degree to which we can say that the will of man exists, this is where it creeps in. I think we can see within the conscious realm that there's a lot of uncertainty, and within balance there's a bit of frustration, because there's no definite answer almost until we make the decision based on limited information, and then the consequences come, or the fruits come. Consequences could be bad or good or bad. But here we have a situation in which a person has jumped that boundary of transgression, and they find themselves in that desert landscape. And they are there, and since they are a human being, because they have a soul, because they have the capacity to exist in the way that they exist, at the level in which they exist, they have this certain draw and pull to them that tempts others to them. And perhaps it's not just the fundamental layer that they exist, but rather the amplifier that they put on top of it, perhaps the reasons that they use, the emotions that they express. It's enticing to those on the other side, especially to those who are unaware that there are sides, or where the boundary is. And so we have a person that, rather than facilitates the expression or the observation of potential risk factors, becomes a beacon or a center point of gravity, almost like an osmotic gradient in which she draws all of the particles to her that then inflate this transgression. And an inflated transgression is going to have inflated negative consequences. She lies in wait as for a prey. She devours them. In what way would she devour them? I mean, we could say that she murders them, perhaps, but it's not. This is not the realm that we are in. I mean, the physical extends to the heavenly, of course, but or the heavenly to the physical, but remaining in the heavenly realm, I think it's easier to conceptualize it in this way, that over there, where she is, when another person comes into her space, they then are added to that light. They become a participant. They become the strange woman. Because they are seduced. They become strange themselves. Their behavior, their actions are different than the rest of that society. Perhaps the boundary has moved. The boundary that is established upon the map of the intelligible world. It may not be right. It's probably a rough approximation at best. But yet every culture and tradition establishes these sorts of things so that it can thrive and flourish. The strange woman shakes that boundary. Perhaps for good, perhaps for bad. Of course, the verse that we're talking about here is for bad. And she and her lot take the seed and produce an invasive species that would destroy that which is across the boundary, perhaps in the positive direction, or pushes the boundary back, so that the people believe then they are on the right side of things, when in fact they are doing things and participating in experiences, forming institutions, participating in particular ways within those institutions that cause them to be ineffective, that cause their understanding of their fellow man to be poor, that cause their own experience to be dull, limiting, stifling. And so I think it's within this way that I come to understand this verse. She also lies in wait as for a prey and increases the transgressors among men. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? who has babbling, who has wounds without cause, who has redness of eyes. They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Look not you upon the wine when it is red, when it gives his color in the cup, when it moves itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Your eyes shall behold a strange woman, and your heart shall utter perverse things. You shall be as he that lies down in the midst of a sea, or as he that lies upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shall you say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. So this is interesting. The Proverbs are full of interesting runs, perhaps we can say. Certain verses are connected to others. Within a chapter we have relatedness throughout the chapter, but it may not be a continuous narrative, maybe we could say. There is a few that I can identify early on in the Proverbs that are this sort of continuous sort. There's an intricate web of relatedness through all of these. Now, if that's the case because it was these verses, these chapters were primarily written by King Solomon, it's hard to say if that's exactly why, or if it's more purposefully woven. But regardless, every once in a while, there may seem to be independent verses, or a couple of related verses, and then the topic changes. Or there are quite a few that are in sequence that are related to one another. And so we are dealing with a verse that spans from, or we're dealing with a series of verses that span from verse 29 through verse 35, which is at the end of the chapter. So it's an interesting thing. It causes us to modify our approach here to examine this verse. Now, verse 29, who has woe, who has sorrow, who has contentions, who has babbling, who has wounds without cause, who has redness of eyes? The answer is in verse 30. Now I wonder, I'm debating in my mind, whether or not I should go through the exercise of answering each one of those questions. For within the wine, surely there is something more to be said there. It is not the physical object of the wine, it is the behavior, it's the consumption of the wine, it's the relationship that one has to it that can lead to these unfortunate states of mind or states of being. So I think, as a matter of exercise, go through each one of these questions. I will try to be as precise and as brief as I can, but I suppose I can't make any promises. These episodes have been running quite long these days. So let's begin with the first. Who has woe? Woe is defined as a condition of deep suffering from misfortune, affliction, or grief. Ruinous trouble, calamity, affliction. Now this affliction is interesting. I'll try not to influence the way that I choose to describe or to come to answer these questions by my awareness of the verse to follow within the wine. But it's likely that I won't succeed. I will try nonetheless. So this affliction, I would say, despite my limitations as a as a human being, we all have limitations, but despite my failures in life, and despite my successes, I suppose, I believe that I can appreciate an affliction. And I think at some level, if one can appreciate an affliction, it can be scaled up or scaled down, depending. And I think true appreciation comes within the relatedness of what we are considering. For an affliction is not just something of a solitary experience. It could bring one to solitude, surely, I think. But an affliction is a relationship. For one to be afflicted, they are burdened by something. In other words, there is some cause to this pain or suffering. Who has woe? Now, if we put it in this way, we all have problems. We all have misfortune. We all have affliction and grief. So one potential answer to this problem is everybody. But it is not everybody all of the time. It is not as though that I walk around constantly afflicted, or at least aware of my afflictions, however minor or however large they are relative to another. It's when my attention finds them, or when my heart finds it, and I think that more often than not, my heart finds it. And one has to wonder why, under this affliction, what does the landscape appear to be? How does one come to be afflicted or misfortuned? I suppose I can only really reflect on my experiences, both personal and also in terms of those that I have observed that are close to me and around me. In a sense, it's easy to be burdened. It's easy to be afflicted. It can be a manner of attention, a manner or way in which we see things, the way in which we relate ourselves to things. For what is our suffering other than that? What makes the 20 pounds that is, let's say, as a physical example, the 20 pounds that is accepted, a load that we carry throughout the day, versus one that is not, that is rather imposed? Both are 20 pounds. Both we carry with us throughout the day, and yet one we disdain, one we consider an affliction, one we consider a burden. I mentioned a while ago about the whore, and in a broad sense, those that take a dark path in life, even on that road, even if it is considered dark, even in the woods, on the trail, when it is dark, there is an aspect of the light that is still there. The moonlight still permeates through it. And it's a matter of what we choose to follow, I suppose. Our environment can be darkened relative to another, but the mind is a powerful thing, and I think that it really has a way of providing us with perspective. And it can be torturous at times to see where we are relative to another, or to see where we are to that which we idealize or think to exist. That in and of itself is an affliction. How high, how far. It can create an irony, a degree of stagnation, for which one is paralyzed by the potential that the burden they carry, the potential weight that is there. Who has woe? But again, of those that fail to see the light, even those that are relative to another, or perhaps by some common standard, are seen to be below, they occupy the same space as we do. I occupy the same space as somebody better off. And I don't just mean materially, I mean cognitively, relationally, all of the important bits that I value. I think about this sometimes when my mind gets caught on the internet and it's surfing through YouTube aimlessly, mindlessly. Who knows what it is actually paying attention to. Desperately trying to select something that is useful for it, but once it finds it, it just sort of uses it as a pacifier more than something that's nutritious and sustaining. I see a lot of irony in front of me, as I know where this path is leading. The interpretation of this verse, who has woe, it is of those who fail to accept their burdens in the face of seeing all that is, with the power of projection, of desire, perhaps of jealousy, that tempts one into that place where the burden becomes almost insurmountable. The mind cannot accept what the reason chooses to propose to it, and perhaps facilitated by some desire. It becomes a problem. Of course, an affliction is a problem, but again, as I've said, it depends on how one relates to that problem. Not seeing the good is dangerous. Or to minimize the good because of our own insecurity, our anxieties to move past the difficult steps to achieve something that we know is to be there, that we can almost feel it and experience it, or perhaps deceive ourselves into experiencing it or feeling it by putting a plug within this woe, within this burden. There are many such plugs. There's one in the next verse that is obvious. And it really makes me think. about the wanting to leave that current state of mind, to move into the inebriated state, to push forward into something that takes away the pain, that numbs everything. There are no shortage of these things in the modern society. It doesn't just have to be the wine. Who has sorrow? Now, before I look up this definition of the word sorrow, if I dove down into the depths of my own understanding of what this emotion is, I think I find a bit of irony. I find a wall. I find something similar to alcohol. Similar, but not the same thing, of course. Something that was created. Something much like a wall, it was erected. Or like a wound, was healed over with scar tissue. And that what sorrow was is now kept in some prison deep within my memory. But the thing is, there's an aspect of self-deception here. Because I believe at some level that my sorrow, or at least the aspect of myself that I'm trying to keep that emotion from, is free from it. And yet it is imprisoned within me. There is a dissociation that has occurred within myself. And I don't think it can be something that is true or lasting. Much like the first question, who has woe? I think we all have woe, we all have sorrow. But again, much like the woe, it is about what we do with the acceptance of that burden. We can deceive ourselves into dissociating from it, almost like cutting off our leg in an attempt to escape it. We lose part of ourselves in the process. Because wherever that thing is that we are trying to escape from is stored within us. It takes up space. There's attention that is directed to avoiding it. Because it is loud, it is painful. We feel it. We try to ignore it, but there is a cost associated with it. So again, the map continues. That we all have woe, we all have sorrow to a degree. It can be heavy. It can cause strange things to happen within the mind. And it is no wonder to me why one may choose to find the cork, so to speak, and to plug it into the hole to stop the pressure. Who has contentions, disagreements? Within the agreements, we find an aspect of harmony. Within the disagreements, we find dissonance, disharmony, disunion, which I suppose at times is okay. Perhaps it's necessary. And much like the first two questions, I think we all have contentions. We all have things, we all have aspects about ourselves that are dissonant, that move away from the harmony for whatever reason. It's a complicated mixture. We have to wonder when we question the harmony what it is, what it represents. Perhaps we desire a different type, a different parallel, a different degree of congruency. But we all have these disagreements within ourselves and between ourselves. Who has babbling? Now this is an interesting one. The woe, the sorrow, and to a degree this contention all seem to have a similar point. They relate to attention, and they relate to the reality that the mind finds itself in, the burdens that it has to bear, the problems that it has to solve. But this babbling, although I think it refers to attention, it's another aspect. It's another aspect of this inattentiveness that instead, rather, of the first few questions relating to the inacceptance of our burdens or of our responsibilities, this babbling is a degree of incoherence of mind. When I think of babbling, I think of a baby that babbles, that says words perhaps, or sounds that I suppose has some meaning, who knows. In some sense, a child may be babbling to themselves to lull them to sleep or whatever, but there's no real meaning in any of it. And in this sense, I think that we all have thoughts that represent this babbling, that we try our best to keep ourselves from absence. And so, if we cannot be stimulated from the environment, and we are stuck within, this babbling occurs, these circling thoughts that go nowhere, the daydreaming. Now here the definition of babbling is talking idly or foolishly, a babbling drunk, producing meaninglessness or meaningless sounds, speech. The drunk, the more I think about these questions, is an individual that is at the other end, or who has taken it upon themselves to reject the burdens, to reject that natural, and to trade it for a dulled expression, a continuation of the inacceptance or the lack of responsibility. And almost they choose to perpetuate the cycle of inattentiveness, so that they will not be responsible for returning to that place of attention. The focused mind that is vulnerable to that light and dark environment, that's vulnerable to all those possibilities. But of course it is directed. purposeful, burdened, but not to the point where it loses itself. Who has wounds without cause? Now here we have the self-inflicted element. Wounds without cause. Such an interesting thing to say. How can one have a wound without a cause? Well, I suppose that if it is not inflicted externally, then it is an internal wound. I said I wouldn't try to corrupt my mind by thinking about the next verse, about the drink, but I can't help it. It's almost a direct reference to it. It is a direct reference to it. It's much harder to imagine wounds without a cause, separated from the internal what? Internal selfishness, internal chaos, violence. Who has redness of the eyes? It's funny that that verse seems to speak itself into it, into the reference to the wine. We start pretty broad. Or who has woe? Well, we all do. Who has sorrow? Maybe some less of us, but we all have a degree of it. Who has contentions? I think we all do. Maybe some have less than others, again. Who has babbling? Well, I get distracted at times. I'm sure other people do. But I wonder if my distraction is worse than others. Who has wounds without a cause? And then it just sort of gets down into the weeds as you go into the questions, which I find kind of interesting. They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Now what I get from this mixed wine versus unmixed wine business is that the mixed sort is of a substance or a solution that has been of multiple different sources, and that the wine itself is this symbol for which man can pervert his attention, and as such that symbol can be modified, it can be mixed, it can be perfected. And the mixed wine is the perfected wine, the wine that of those who spend a lot of time concerned about how wine tastes, for example. They come to these precise mixtures and concoctions, perhaps in terms of the alcohol content. That would be one obvious solution to an increase or an uptick in the severity of this problem, but also just generally the highlighting of attention that one places towards alcohol in general. That the mixture of substances, one must go through a process of deliberation and, of course, attention to come to something that they like so that they can continually enjoy it. And I think I've spoken sufficiently at how the wine can fit into this problem of woe, sorrow, contention. It can become the cause of it, but also it could be the result of something that then became the thing to prevent it or to plug the hole, creating this sort of never-ending positive feedback loop of despair and self-destruction. Look not you upon the wine when it is red, when it gives its color in the cup, when it moves itself aright. Okay, so this is a verse that is not immediately understandable to me. Also, I should mention that today is a new day. It's going to take me some time to open this landscape up again. Look not you upon the wine when it is red. So we're going to start here. Now, I don't know much about making wine, but I would have to imagine that if we are using red grapes, then the wine is going to be red. And I don't think the verse is to imply that there is a state in the process of making wine that it will be something other than that red color. For in its state, in its natural condition, it is always red. So we could take a rather simple road and say, well, the verse is just saying that if it's always red, don't look at it. It's almost a comedic. There's almost a comedic element to this interpretation. But I wonder if there's more to be said about this. Look not you upon the wine when it is red. I don't think that there's too much beyond the literal sense or the literary sense here. But I do think that there is a slightly different interpretation. That there is something about the color that would tempt our gaze or direct it. There are some things in nature that are red by their nature, but I think that the color is infrequent, such that when we look around, if we just sort of imagine more of a primitive state in which all of our material goods, in which these days we are accustomed to many different colors, we see reds everywhere, from the traffic lights to the brake lights to the shirts that we wear to the colors of our cars, the color perhaps of our buildings, the red brick. But within nature, although there is red, like the color of blood, the color of some birds, the color of many things, surely, but the presence of that color, I think, is less than others, like green or blue, for example. And because of this, I think that the color red has a particular pull to it in this context, that it draws the eye. And since that eye is so fundamental to our experience, towards our higher level cognitive seeing sense, that there is an increased likelihood or probability that because we are gazing upon the redness, that we would then be tempted to partake in consuming that redness. So there's a deceptive element here. There's I think, a call to reflect on the importance of where we place our attention. For I think another telling aspect of the first part of this verse is we begin with the word look. Look not upon the wine when it is red. It's not saying drink, not you upon the wine when it is red. If it was drink, I think it would be more of that sort of comedic interpretation, because, well, the wine's always going to be red, so it just means never drink it. I think that, again, there's still an element of that in this verse. It's still implying not to drink it. But the addition of the word look prompts us to consider the importance of our attention. Look not you upon the wine when it is red, when it gives his color in the cup. Another interesting way to phrase this First we have when it, sort of the inanimate object, gives his color in the cup. So we are referring to a degree of agency. Now, something that is he obviously is referring to the masculine, the male, is referring to the human being, or something that's human-like, human-esque. When it gives his color in the cup. His color, I think, implies something broader. I don't think it is to agentatize, if that's can be used as a word, the wine. But I think that there's an element in which, if we are to say that there is an agentic arena, that we live within a world that is full of agency, as we do live in a world that is full of intelligibility, I think it could be suggested, it could be reflected upon at the very least, that the wine, as well as everything that is in the perceivable reality, that can be occupied by the space of the agents, by the agentic, may use the objects, or use the software of mind for their own purposes. And here it's difficult not to anthropomorphize, to see things, to see beings, or to see agents that are something other than human beings. Of course, we have many agentic beings that exist at a lower level of consciousness than we. But we don't necessarily think about a deer in the woods tempting us with the color red towards some absence of attention. Now, this purposeful, directed sense in which I am interpreting this, projecting it perhaps onto the world, may not be accurate, and I fully accept that possibility. But all the same, at the very least, I think it is an interesting thought to consider the pull that objects have on the conscious mind, the relationship that they have. And I suppose we can make the argument that it is self-deception all the way down. Self-deception all the way down. Down to what, exactly? And what are we being deceived from? Well, of course, this concept of deception is that the mind is considering something about the world independent of that entity or the agent that is within, or perhaps within is not a good word, the agent that exists, that is bound to his physical being, that this agency can misunderstand the associations that exist within the environment and that are brought to him through the tethers of his physical being. The tethers being the various ways in which he can perceive information, whether it be proprioceptive, whether it be visual, auditory, any of these types of information. Now, of course, it's possible that one could be deceived all the way down and just make false associations until there are no true associations. But if this was the case, the agent would perish, because the body would perish. It wouldn't be able to connect the information that it is taking in with the map or the projection that the agent is forming over top of the underlying physical reality. Certainly it is possible to be said that of an agent, of the type of agents that we are, it doesn't necessarily have to be that we make a false association and then that characterizes all of our attempts at associating things together. Rather, it is obviously the case, or apparently so, that within our experience we may make false judgments and true judgments. The true judgments, at least at the base level that I've been considering, are those that are tied to what I desire to call reality, but I will say are tied to the physical underpinnings that facilitate its agency. When it gives his color in the cup. And so I continue to struggle exactly where this his is and what kind of agent we are considering. I have a difficult time accepting that just because there is the possibility of the redness tempting man's attention, it doesn't necessarily mean that the redness itself is agentic. But similarly, I suppose, just because there are aspects of ourselves that may draw our attention, it doesn't mean that that aspect is agentic. The agent is something that exists on top. It is the back door, if you will, of experience. The soulful, intelligible plug through which the physical underpinning of reality has any purpose or meaning. When it gives his color in the cup, when it moves itself aright. Now, aright, a word meaning properly, correct, accurately. And so let's take it as a whole, because I think that this verse is getting at something quite interesting. Look not you upon the wine when it is red, when it gives his color in the cup, when it moves itself aright. Again, there is this attribution of agency to the wine, when it, referring to the wine, moves itself, a willful directed action, towards that which is right. I suppose if we imagine this more in the Platonic sense, that there is the form of the wine has a degree of agency, perhaps that we don't necessarily have to make a direct parallel to the type of agent that man is. But of its different qualities, it has something that can be considered an object or a being, I suppose. A being, I think we generally consider it to have life involved in it, but if we take life out of the situation, the scenario, we do remove a fundamental difference. However, we still have two things that are identifiable between man, perhaps his agency, and that of the wine. And of the wine, unlike man, there is not this complexity. There is not this simplicity of being. That the degree to which it has agency or a will of its own depends on, just like man, its physical underpinning and structure. It exists as something in and of itself, regardless of if man chooses to attend to it. But it is within that relationship that this type of agent has to the agent that we consider ourselves to be, that then it produces something new, something different. It modifies the agent that consumes it or interacts with it. And when it says, when it gives his color in the cup, what is being implied here, at least to my interpretation, is the expression of that agent. It's the expression of that which is, the object itself, the wine. When it moves itself aright. When it is as it is, or perhaps when it is perceived as it is, when it is understood that this is something that can alter our minds. It is understood for qualities that are accurate. But of course, our will uses those qualities to our ends. At the last it bites like a serpent, and stings like an adder. A further expression of this agentic quality, no doubt, to the wine. At the last it bites like a serpent. Now, why does a serpent bite? What is a serpent bite like? Well, serpent bites to protect itself. It bites to inject poison into us. It bites to provide for itself. But I would have to say that my mind at least thinks that this is inconsequential. This is not the same sort of thing. Two biological beings interacting with one another. But there's a way in which this metaphor draws a thread, I think, through all of it. And it's a matter of finding that thread. That the wine in this situation is sort of like the poison. And that it is the interaction of the wine in a particular manner, just like we can interact with a serpent in a particular manner, that will cause us to be poisoned, or to provoke in it something that would cause it to have a particular relationship with us. And so I don't necessarily think that it's saying that wine is bad in and of itself, just perhaps like the serpent isn't bad in and of itself. But the capacity is there. The capacity to disrupt the attention, the capacity to divert the eyes, to behold strange women, and to tempt the heart, and to utter perverse things, as is said in this next verse. And so there is a bit of enchantment here that I must admit that I feel, but I have yet to really grasp. I understand that there are these metaphors, but deep within the relationships there is something that I, in my contemporary, modern, scientific mind perhaps, natural mind, it fails to see some of these close relationships. and it fails to see it because of the way in which it chooses to see. And there are plenty of things that I can identify by this, for which I may deceive myself and run down the road of attributing falsehood to something that was designed to guide me towards some truth. But it's a matter of how I see it, to discover it. So here we are, a new day. And I was discussing this very topic, or at least something close to it, with somebody at work today. Now the topic had to do with the way in which the mind values certain things, not others. The sense of perspective. In this particular situation, the individual was relaying a story to me where a mother had hung her child, or hanged her child from a banister. And in the courtroom, I suppose her justification was that she felt as though he was too hard to care for, or he was too difficult to manage, that he frustrated her. And so she decided, based on those distinctions, to end his life. And the decision to do such things was the topic of discussion. The question was, where is the mind? Where does the mind find itself such that it sees that road as one of the viable options? Not just hypothetically, but realistically. Now that's not a good word to use, I understand. But in the sense that it transfers to the physical domain, there is in my mind a quality of immediacy. I said earlier, realize reality. There's something about the physical sphere as opposed to just the conscious, thoughtful domain. Perhaps we could say the objective, once it is something that can be shared readily among people, an event that can be readily shared among people, then we are more apt to call it real. Your eyes shall behold strange women, strange things. Your heart shall utter strange things, perverse things. Now, as I've said earlier, in verse 29, where it's just a series of questions, who has woe, who has sorrow, who has contentions, who has babbling, who has wounds without cause, who has redness of eyes, that is an exercise to be done in and of itself. The follow-up is, it could be whatever. We can place a lot of things in that follow-up, the answer to that question. Although I did mention that it becomes a bit more specific as the verse goes on. There is an element, an aspect, for which, when we return to the source, that is the potential for the mind to be disrupted, or maybe disrupted isn't the best way to say it. For what are we trying to say? It is we can, in some sense, language is kind of hard to use here, but in this space, let's just say within the conscious realm for now, there is, and there must be, a projection onto the world that we see. We are imperfect beings. We are unable to take all of the information from the environment into our minds. Although we are able to take in a lot of the information that we are able to take in, it's limited to a certain level. It's a practical level. Practical for us in our survival. It's been a while since I have invoked this image, but the image of the Russian doll always comes back to me. That of this object, a doll, a painted figurine, that you are able to take apart, and within it there's another doll, within that doll another doll, within that one another one, etc. They are all similar in shape, and in imagistically they look the same, artistically, but they vary based on their size, on their scale. And the thought that I'm having now is much like this. That when I mention all of this business about perception and about the limited manner in which man articulates with his environment, and because of the limitations, there is this possibility, a certain probability, a certain inevitability of being mistaken, of making some judgment that is false, of having some belief that by our behavior, by the reaction, we understand it to be something that either should be modified or gotten rid of. Now, keeping in mind this Russian doll, where is the similarity in kind, but the difference in scale? And I think the answer lies within this alcohol analogy or example. The answer to this question is something that takes. It is something that perverts. It is something that misdirects. But it is not something that takes us away fundamentally. Perhaps it can, I suppose, but not necessarily fundamentally from our goings in the world. We can still have a physical presence while being under the influence of something. And if we zoom out a little bit, we take away the substance. We even zoom out past perhaps an inebriated mind or a sober mind that had, I had mentioned earlier about the woman that had murdered her son. We could just assume for a moment that she was sober. There was something about her mind we would consider to be a bit inebriated, even if it's not physically, but inebriated in the sense that the effects are quite similar. And so this is not quite at the point or the parallel analogy of the Russian doll, but I'm headed in that direction. There's more to this picture. That if we zoom out farther past the woman and her sober state, for which she has come to some understanding that while the majority may find her behavior dreadful, she finds it justified. we can find ourselves within the majority. Another symbol or analogy that I have used before is that there is, rather paradoxically it would seem, and there are verses that point to this, that there is a periphery in every center, that there are elements of that which we would wish to be outside of the city walls, embedded within the city. There are aspects of our frailty and of our imperfection that we would wish just to exist outside of our experience. But as I've mentioned with the perceptual example and the amount of information that we can take in, and that it is necessarily limited, or perhaps it is limited by our nature, there's a certain aspect of the example of the alcoholic that satisfies the questions in verse 29. There's a certain aspect that finds itself within the experience of the woman that chose to murder her child. And there's a certain aspect within the experience of man in general for which he has an incomplete projection of reality. Again, a bad word to use, because what do I mean by reality? In the modern way of thinking, it is that which is apart from the self. It is objective. But of course, this breaks down at some point, because the subject is a part of that world too. And the subject's interface with the world is important. And so the Russian doll parallel doesn't necessarily lie in congruency completely within deception. This is not what I'm concerned with here, although we understand it to be a probability, a possibility. But more so, what I'm considering here is a way of seeing in general. That much like this experience of alcohol, it changes one's way of seeing. In this context, we would consider it to be negative, for this is something that has caused us to be bitten by a serpent and stinged by an adder. It causes our eyes to see strange things, but we can easily flip this around. We can imagine different situations, different substances perhaps, in which a person may walk a path for which their eyes shall behold beautiful things. The heart shall utter good things. And within both of these examples, we can say that one is true and one is false. There are, again, I think there are levels by which we can consider one thing false and one thing true. For who is to say that seeing strange women, or beholding strange women, or uttering perverse things is false? Now, I think that there's a way in which we can come to understand that this is false. But the way in which we come to it, I think, is quite different from the way in which we come to understand the physical nature of, let's say, wine, for example. We can pick anything. Or it's connected, but it is connected in a way that our society and our culture, my mind, doesn't understand. Now certainly there's a relationship between methods of finding truth and truth itself. So I will say by assertion that I do think that there is a strong connection. But all the same, I suppose what I would like to make more concrete, make a little bit more precise, is this aspect of mind, the way of seeing at all of the various different levels, all of the ways in which we can find one thing false and another thing true, perhaps not the same thing, but there is, fractally, there is the center of the city, there is the outside, and then there's a different level. There is the city, then there is the province or jurisdiction, then there's the inside and the outside of this province or jurisdiction. There's the state, the inside and the outside of the state. We can think of the cell, one particular cell, and the body. There's the inside and there's the outside. Within the cell wall, there are different organs. The centerpiece of the cell, perhaps the nucleus, there is an inside and the outside to the nucleus. To our experience, there are various ways in which man can see, substance or not. He may at one level understand where he is, within his occupation, within his role within the community. Perhaps there's another level for which he is completely unaware, maybe an extension of his role in the community, his participation in the broader state or government as a free citizen. Or his awareness and understanding of certain modes of thought, whether it be economic, scientific, political, historical, philosophical. And throughout all of these layers, throughout all of the ways of seeing, there is this inside and the outside. There is the dynamic within for which our projections are false. And there is the strong rejection of the mind's best understanding of the way in which the thing outside of what it considers is false. And so this Russian doll has the poison of the adder and of the serpent within it at every level, but also without it. It is something of an aspect or a constant either of our experience or of existence itself, independent of man. I have a hard time with this. I have a hard time with nothingness. I have a hard time with ending, with non-existence, with non-being. But ironically, I don't necessarily fear my ending or my death. I suppose it's because I have this faith in that which is, and that which is, independent of my understanding of my level, will continue. Now, I'll leave that there for now. I think this is something that will return, especially in later verses and later books in the Bible. Your eyes shall behold strange women, and the heart shall utter perverse things. So let's think about this for a little bit. Let's start with the first half of this verse. Your eyes shall behold strange women. Now, the strange woman is no stranger, ironically enough, to the Proverbs. This is a common symbol, common theme. But let's begin with this word, strange. Now, the strange thing is that in its Proto-Germanic roots, we have a word that means strong, firm, but also meaning unusual or unexpected. Now, the original meaning of strange in Middle English meant alien, foreign, and it took on meaning over time, becoming something that is odd, peculiar, unexpected. And one point that I would like to make, I think it's interesting that since I started with this inside-outside business of that which we value so highly to be at the center, and yet there's an element of that which we despise most readily and without thought also finds its home there. And of course, it's all a balance. We would like it to be, and in times for which humanity is considered to be prosperous, I think the negative elements are well outside of the central. Although, I'm not sure if they can ever really be eradicated entirely. But nonetheless, this definition, or the etymological chain, reminds me of this. For we have something that is strong and sturdy, firm, something that is dependable, reliable, and then we have its opposite, something that is unusual or unexpected. Within the strong or firm, we would imagine some semblance of expectation, reliability, dependability, this return to discipline, of order. Now, perhaps it's not necessary to dwell too much on this earlier meaning, because of course the word strange has evolved over time. The words unfamiliar, unusual, unexpected, odd, out of the ordinary, these are all statements of going away from something. When we think of the prefix un, like undo, unusual, uncertain, I think what is implied here is a negation or some reversal, something that is opposite or something in absence. And so if we are to consider a reversal or an absence, again, of something, I think of unfamiliar, uncertain. I imagine almost this black hole-like structure that the stranger occupies. They occupy this sort of symbolic image within the conscious landscape. And within them, whether they know it or not, perhaps, they draw attention, they draw meaning, they draw stability, and they take it up into themselves to be demolished, to be undone, to be negated, to be reversed. Now, I think that there are situations in which we would want to see something that is established, reversed, or undone. But like most situations, especially when times are good, undoing something, especially something fundamental, would have catastrophic consequences. And so we can readily appreciate what the strange can do. In my life, I have encountered the strange before. Can't say how many times. Certainly there has been a period of my life where I've gone through certain emotional difficulties, perhaps, that I have felt this negation, reversal, undoing, uncertainty. Sometimes this uncertainty led me to wander. It led me to confusion, stagnation. And at other times I recognized the strange as something that was liberating from some ideas that were stifling and limiting. Of course, we have to remember the context for which we are talking. We're talking about the type of strange that perverts our attention, that draws it away, that moves it down towards the darkness and into the pit. Your eyes shall behold strange women. So our attention is now towards the undoing or the negation of where our attention was before. Moreover, since we are considering this in the context of a series of verses, our attention is altered by something, by a substance in this case. And it is because our attention is altered that we are now seeking the vain and the superficial. We are moving into that black hole of the strange woman. And your heart shall utter perverse things. So what does this mean? The heart to utter perverse things. The heart, again, an organ of mind that I have been considering to be much like a factory producing the fundamental, the raw emotions, the seat of our desire. For to utter something is to say something, it is to speak something. But utterances, I think, are often subtle, quiet, almost as if one is in a trance. Like one is to, as if one were to wake up from a deep sleep and then to utter something, to say something under one's breath. Perhaps they are only partially aware of what they say. And I think the state of mind that we are in, we can consider it a drunken stupor, but just generally speaking, I think the period in which the mind is occupied by the inattentiveness is sufficient to imagine this type of situation. These days, one need not alcohol to find one drunk on inattentiveness. The satisfaction of the superficial attention, the attention that desires a quick fix, a rush of information that satisfies something, somewhere, difficult to describe, but easy to experience if one goes on Instagram or YouTube. The endless sea of information, content, things that are designed and filtered for our own experiences and meant to distract, perhaps not explicitly, but in the end they take us quite far from productive means or productive ends. these utterances, the inebriated state of mind, the mind that is trying perhaps to cling to something, cling to the world. In this situation, we see a mind that is so absorbed by this darkness that when it finds itself in a space where it wishes to produce meaning, to articulate something, all it wishes to say is something that is perverse. Now, this word perverse, I think, is important. It's a fundamental word. Much like the word strange, we have a bunch of un-words. We have a bunch of words that offer us negation or reversals of a person or their actions, showing a deliberate and obstinate desire to behave in a way that is unreasonable or unacceptable, often in spite of the consequences. Unhelpful, unreasonable, uncooperative, contrary to the accepted or expected standard or practice. Now again, I'll make the caveat. There may be an accepted standard or practice for which that standard must be changed. I think our history is full of coming to or moving away from good practices into new ones, and to running into different difficulties. Perhaps we're ascending the step, this heavenly staircase, and at every step we reach a point where we are challenged, where we are forced to make a sacrifice. We are forced to design a new standard. These are painful periods. We have to let a lot go and let a lot in. But to avoid too much confusion, again, we have to be grounded in the context of the series of these verses. That is, we find a person that is lost. They are lost because of their behavior that has led them to drink. The drink is now facilitating this inattentiveness. The inattentiveness is now in a positive feedback loop. It is tempting itself into the into the nothing, into the negation, into the identification of something that is, only to say and to identify aspects of that thing that are strange, to identify things that would negate its meaning, perhaps, to nullify it in our own minds, only to excuse our behavior. For if we disregard everything, we reverse everything, we say that the meaning of everything is actually meaningless, then we are giving ourselves an excuse to enter into that state of inattentiveness, to enter into the inebriated state of the alcoholic. But I would like to try and explore something a bit farther. That this state, the belief, your heart shall utter perverse things, the belief that the attention ought to be towards that which is absent. Again, I come back to the concept of nothingness. I want to get away from this definition of the word, or the definition that perhaps I should say the interpretation in which I spoke of using the concept of meaninglessness or of absence as an excuse towards inattentiveness. This may be a potential path, but this is not the belief. At the core, this is not what is being acted out by this person. Of course, it's at some level it's an excuse, but it's only an excuse if something else, is to be there. The belief is totalizing. If a person falls into this sort of unfortunate trap. That trap of nothingness, much like the strange woman who takes into her the attentive capacity and perhaps she stores it where it sustains her. Perhaps she does nothing with it. It is a matter of sport. It doesn't really matter who wins or loses. It's nice to see the competition, but the information dies in the end. What does it mean for something to believe nothing? To have no faith? Now, I could say that I've been there. I can say that I have desired nothing. I can say that I still, to this day, have an aspect of me that wishes for nothing. And that is just to shut my mind off. And perhaps we do this all the time when we feel exhausted to go to sleep. But during my waking hours, or my alert hours, I find that there are periods of frustration that I am unsatisfied with something, and it almost comes over me as a wave that I can't prevent. Now, certainly there's probably an answer to this sort of thing. But I think it's not really a matter of precision here. The waves will come. This is part of life and part of everyone's experience. I think there's a productive and yet general approach to this sort of dilemma. I realize that I have two thoughts going here. One is of my experience currently, and then one is my attempt to understand what it means to believe in absolutely nothing. But within the paralleled thoughts here, there are elements of the way in which I live life now that contain the belief of the unbeliever. And in this situation, what I would like to, again, try to do more completely is to separate out the idea that if I believe in nothing, now it doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in something that is not real, but that there is a faith somewhere there versus an absence of faith. That was a bit sloppy, but in other words, to separate out that absence from the presence, and of the presence, to have this be something that is not naive, it is not something that is, and I'm prompted to consider this and to say this, I think because of the time that I find myself in, that it is not of this presence, of the presence. It is not something that is founded in falsehood. It is more something that it's practical, it's methodical, experiential, precise to a degree, where precision is necessary. but coheres, that allows me to unify readily, allows me to maintain my attention readily. It allows me to find things about life that are truly meaningful. They're not vain, they're not superficial. And there must be a pre-existing belief that exceeds the current state, for which I think that I have found a degree of that. I would not want to downplay it. But just as I have found a degree of the way, the good, that which is beautiful, that cliche, the true, the good, and the beautiful. Again, I have to reiterate that I also carry with me a burden that is quite old in terms of my lifespan, something that has been dying slowly, that came to a peak maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and sort of has slowly been receding since. It is that perpetual contrarian, the contrarian that is satisfied with nothing except when the mind is nothing. And I think it's difficult to separate out when it is the case that I'm being inquisitive or desirous of the truth, and when I'm just sort of an irritable mess that wishes for my mind to stop thinking. Because within the contrary nature, one can continue all the way down, continue to challenge their uncertainties and their doubts. And it's a challenge not so that they can rise above, but it's a challenge so that they can stay within a particular frame of mind. And again, I think it's the frame of mind of nothingness, of solving problems for nothing. You shall be as he that lies down in the midst of a sea, or as he that lies upon the top of a mast. Now, thinking about the contexts of these verses, so far we have been led into what this consequence is. The consequence is laid out through a series of different metaphors, analogies. It is meant to point to something that is unseen, something that is experienced, something that is felt, something that is deep within the psychology of man. And I almost wish that the author in verse 30 and verse 29, more so verse 30, I think 29 is good because it gives us an option to consider outside of the effect of alcohol. But I wish that verse 30, they that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine, I wish this was something more fundamental. Again, I'm not too concerned about it, because by verse 29 we're prompted to consider bigger questions, more than just the wine. But the wine is, of course, one of the potential roads down this path. But this is all the more heightened, the sense I have, that I wish it was something more foundational, perhaps. Although we can infer the foundation through the verse. I wish it was more foundational because in verse 34, the one that we were just going over, yeah, you shall be as he that lies down in the midst of a sea, or as he that lies upon the top of a mast. That is quite the imagery. Along with the one before, your eyes shall behold strange women, your heart shall utter perverse things. At last, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. These are very imagistic verses. And I am somebody that lives life and it has experienced life such that there's something that can come up and grab you that just isn't the effect of something like alcohol. I think many times the thing that jumps up and grabs us is what leads us to the alcohol. And it's all good to say that although we may be tempted by falling into alcohol, we may be falling into something that then this alcohol gives us the reason to go farther, to be in the darker environment, to pursue this strange woman, to wish and to desire that which is reversed or undone, including most fundamentally our attention and our relatedness to the world and others. You shall be as he that lies down in the midst of a sea. Quite an interesting image. My mind goes to the physical body resting in a sea under all sorts of different conditions. We have to consider that outside of the practicality of being able to survive at sea, just sort of being in it, we have to imagine that if our existence was as chaotic or as barren as this place, it would be quite an experience. It would be lonely. Again, it would be chaotic. It would be dangerous. It would be a struggle. It would be fatiguing, exhausting. It would be disorienting. We would not know where we are relative to other objects because everything is pretty much just the sea. It's just water. It's just the same. Or, as he that lies upon the top of a mast. So today is a new day. I'm going to continue with the second half of the verse, as I've just stated. So I've been talking about this sense, this idea, this general illustration of being lost consciously. And it's such a strange, well, perhaps I should use my language a little bit more carefully. There's an element about our experience, the conscious domain, the thoughtful domain, that contains so much possibility, so much life, so much that there is there to discover. There's so many different ways in which one can experience life and to go about finding things that fulfill them and that drive them. There are different levels by which we can reflect on these experiences. There are some that may not reflect on their experiences at all, or very little, and may be just concerned with what is next, what is in front of them. And there are others that I'm sure are more introspective, that are concerned about their own thoughts, their feelings to a degree. There's everything in between. Above and below, this is not a linear sort of thing. But all the same, regardless of where we are, I think we can find ourselves in this space of inattentiveness, of moving away from that sense of the strange, that which is on the outside, that which is in some sense transitional between different experiences, different periods in life. Liminality, I think, is one of these spaces. It occupies a strange, as I've said, in-between. And the in-between is strange because, depending on what the situation is, our view of the world, perhaps the way in which we behave, the way in which we see or imagine the world to be, and our role in it, may change dramatically. Now, whether it be a transitional period or something a little bit more unfortunate, a general uncertainty, a general, like in the case of an alcoholic, that extends out his desperation and in an attempt to continue experiencing and continue living, he turns to the bottle to dull and dim the sensations of life, or to make him interface with the world differently so that he may not experience what it's like raw, if you will. Or is he that lies upon the top of a mast? We have to think what this might mean. I'm sure there's a historical context here for the person that lies upon the top of the mast. By a quick search, I feel like I had known some of this, but a person who is at the top of the mast is typically responsible for looking for hazards, monitoring weather, serving as a lookout for potential enemies, communication, navigation and aid, all of these sorts of things. Now, I don't necessarily think that these qualities are being mentioned here in the verse. I think it is referring to something else. Now, it is, I suppose I could say it's possible that the person that's on top of the mast sees that they are lost at sea, perhaps. And it's unfortunate because they see it, and yet there's nothing they can do about their situation, that they're almost condemned to this position. But I don't like that interpretation. It's possible that that the top of the mast serves as a place for the drunkard to go and be away from the rest of the crew, the people that he depends on, the people that he has to be related to in order to navigate the ocean or the sea. Now, the third possibility, I think, is probably most likely. It is the combination between the two. It is that this person, the drunkard, is up at the top in this mast. They are shirking on their responsibilities. Perhaps they are afforded a degree of this laziness because of their position, but it is a high position. They are responsible for seeing quite a lot. So not only does their drunkenness affect themselves in terms of their sight, they cannot perform their duties, but also it puts others at risk. They are not able to receive the communication about navigation, potential enemies, what's in front of them that the others might not see. So I think that this is related certainly to the alcohol trend, the thread that we've been following. But again, I'd like to think of this in broader terms, something that is not just brought on by alcohol, but that this is something that can be brought on just by willful experience. Somebody can have quite a lazy approach to life, or perhaps it's not laziness, it may manifest similar to laziness, but perhaps it is something of an uncertainty about life, a decision made out of anger or spite, perhaps, in which life is just a little bit more difficult to live, perhaps because of some experience that some or one has had early on in life. It's hard to say, but regardless of how it comes to be, I think that this is a possibility. And so this to me seems a little bit more general than that of the alcohol example, because like I've said earlier, something has to happen for the alcohol to take hold. Perhaps it's something small, but what's small can grow and it can fester. They have stricken me, shall you say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. So what stands out to me here is the word they. They have stricken me. We're going to start here. So, fundamental to understanding this verse is understanding they. We see it twice. And then we have to understand it. So in terms of they have stricken me, shall you say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. So there's this mysterious force. Is it a person? Is it a general observation of something that flows in the environment that influences us? What can we say of it? Now, I may have mentioned that I'm interested in the word it, but reading it again, it's not really something that's interesting me. It refers to this beating that this person is taking. I think that the beating is interesting, how this can come about through whatever we consider they to be. Okay, so they. Now, assuming that we are following this analogy or landscape that is laid out for us about the alcohol and the effects that can have on the mind and on our experience, to refer to alcohol as they doesn't seem to be quite right. It would seem as though that the word they is referring to either somebody or a group of people or a process by which we can conceptualize or attribute a degree of agency. They have stricken me. And my mind goes to demons as the culprit of they. But as I thought about it, the word demons really doesn't have the type of sway or influence that I would like it to have, at least in my mind. That's not to say that there's no strong definition of the word demon, but given what I know, given what I wish to understand, I think that this using the word is not sufficient. I have to describe what it is. So there's something that comes from this relationship that we have to the alcohol. And I think there is a good argument to be made that what is they is a projection of mind, a bit of a delusion, or of a strong, out-of-control desire that has led us to a certain type of behavior, that has led us to the state of being stricken. Now, I think what's interesting is to think about the uncontrollable element there, because surely there's a part of mind that would wish, in the case that they are aware of the potential negative effects that the alcohol or of a particular behavior that it is having on their lives. And the question is, well, why is there such a disharmony? Why is there such dissonance, disagreement? What is it about the self that fails to unify? We can place the blame on the self. We can say that there is nothing about that which is outside of the self that is influencing that experience. Or we can make the assertion that there is a relatedness of the self to the environment, no matter how much or how internal or introspective a person might be. The relationship is fundamental to his experience. Even his thoughts are in some way related to the environment, whether it be through his memories, or through your immediate perception, immediate sense information. So perhaps there's some way in which we have not adjusted ourselves to the environment such that the dissonance, the disagreement between perhaps the reason and the heart, for example, the two strings are apart. They are not vibrating as they are not hitting the same note. They're not in harmony. They're not in unison. They're not in tandem. And because they are not in this harmony, it causes all of this discord to occur. But much like perhaps the tuners on the guitar, it's not our picking that's responsible for the tuning. It is the apparatus. It is the mechanism. It is the forethought that goes into the tuning that causes the guitar to become tuned. I think in a like manner, the tuner is something that rests outside of the music or of the experience that is being played within the mind. Now, of course, the mind has an influence on this tuner. It can desire certain tunings. It can desire to be completely disharmonious and engage in that type of behavior, reach for the bottle. But ultimately, this environment, the place in which we find ourselves, has a large influence, I think, on why the mind wishes to be tuned in a particular way. And because of this outside nature, I think that the word "they" is probably appropriate. Because there is a force that's outside of us that seemingly influences very intimate, internal discussions. They have stricken me, shall you say, and I was not sick. Now here we have a separation of the earthly and of the heavenly. They have stricken me, and I was not sick. This they and the stricken me, this is the heavenly, this is the conscious domain. This is made more clear when we go to the earthly. And I was not sick, so this is referring to more of a physical, mechanistic experience. We all experience sickness. It's a different thing entirely to experience like a depressed state of mind, a melancholic state of mind. Of course, the two can be related. It may bring on, the sickness of the body may bring on thoughts of an existential nature. But I do believe that what we're talking about here is the the more the demonic nature or the perverse nature within the world, within the environment, within whatever, this force that is influencing us is different in its makeup and its qualities from that of the physical illness. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. This is another separation, this heaven and the earthly. For to be beaten, one would imagine, peripherally, we would feel it, we would be bruised, we would be sore. But to feel it not, this is different. It's a different type of feeling, perhaps. Now, to be beaten is, in this situation, since we're considering the alcohol, or our state of mind, to be beaten is to have the attention subdued. Now, to be beaten physically is to be subdued physically. When shall I wake? I will seek it yet again. Now, seeking it is seeking the beating. Now, perhaps because the physical body is relatively okay. Of course, we all understand that there is a relationship between this type of behavior, the alcoholic, and physical health. But the point being, when the person wakes outside of the desire for inattentiveness, and when the return of that judge makes itself known, we will seek to be inebriated and to be free of that judgment. And I suppose that the reason for that is unique to any one particular individual. Quite a unique and intricate process by which one can find themselves in that unfortunate nightmare. In any case, I'm going to end this episode here. This concludes chapter 23 of the Proverbs. And I will continue next time with chapter 24. Now, it has been a long road so far. We have a lot to go still. But this is a reminder to myself and to anyone in the future that may listen to this. Not every day, not every verse is going to have a particularly fulfilling interpretation. I don't mean to say that what I've spoken about here is unfulfilling. Just the process of doing is important. But it's a reminder to be had that regardless of how we feel, we must remain faithful and accept the responsibilities that we have. One of the responsibilities of life, I think, is to participate in things like this. To expand our view of that mental landscape. Not to deceive ourselves, but to find ourselves in proper relation to what's truly important.